my question is, in your professional, yes, the question that I have is...
Joe, you're going to have to turn down your radio or just keep going ahead with your statement or comment, please.
We'll leave this Washington discussion to go live to the floor of the U.S. House, where members are returning to vote on bills debated earlier today.
H.R. 2747 by the yeas and nays, S130 by the yeas and nays. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1155 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1155, a bill to reform the National Association of Registered Agents and Brokers and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
So a series of 3 votes in the House this time, the first dealing with licensing requirements for insurance brokers who are doing business across state lines. After that will be votes on a bill aiming to simplify claims processing for federal contractor employees, and then votes on a lands bill. So a 15-minute vote followed by 2 5-minute votes. While members are voting, remarks now from Senate leaders this morning dealing with a legislative response in the Senate on the situation in Syria.
We're engaged in a very important debate. The Syria debate is one that can't be taken lightly, and I believe that no one has taken it lightly. The discussion and the bipartisan resolution under consideration is simply too important to be rushed through the Senate or given short shrift. So it's right and proper that the President be given an opportunity to meet with senators from both parties as he is today. He will meet with us at 12:30. When he finishes with us, it's my understanding he will report to the conference of Senator McConnell. In addition to that, he's going to address the nation tonight. He's going to speak directly to the American people about the potential for limited military action in Syria. He's going to do that at 9 o'clock tonight. As I said last night, it's appropriate to allow other conversations to go on. We now have, as a result of some work done by other countries, France, Russia, and we understand Syria is involved in this, and this is aimed at avoiding military action. We'll have to see if this works out. It's very important to understand that the only reason Russia is seeking an alternative to military action is that President Obama has made it plain and clear that the United States will act if we must. Our credible threat of force has made these diplomatic discussions with Syria possible. And the United States shouldn't withdraw from the direction we're taking as a country. If there's a realistic chance, and I certainly hope there is, to secure Syria's chemical weapons and prevent further atrocities of the Assad regime, we shouldn't turn our backs on that chance. But for such a solution to be plausible, the Assad regime must act quickly to prove their offer is real and not merely a ploy to delay military action or action of this body, the United States Senate. Any agreement must also assure chemicals, weapons in the hands of Syria can be secured. And this can be done in an open process, even in the midst of this ongoing war that we have in Iraq. And any agreement must ensure that Syria is unable to transfer its dangerous chemical weapons to the hands of terrorists in that area. Such an attempt would be met with a rapid response, and it would be robust from the United States. So I'm pleased that the administration is considering this offer. I am pleased that other countries are involved, in addition to Russia. It's my understanding it's my understanding that France is heavily involved as of a few hours ago, and I think that's the right direction at this time. And we move forward, but under the general criteria that I've suggested and outlined. The Senate should give these international discussions time to play out, but not unlimited time. That's why, although there's support to move forward and debate this bipartisan resolution reported by Senators Menendez and Corker. They did a terrific job for the committee last week. I didn't rush to file cloture as indicated last night, and a motion to proceed to this. We don't need to prove how quickly we can do this, but how well we can do this. The Syrian regime should fully understand that the United States is watching very, very closely. And the Assad regime should be warned. Our country will not tolerate this breach of human decency and long-held international consensus against the use of chemical weapons. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the order with respect to S-1392, which is the energy efficiency legislation, be modified so that the motion to proceed be agreed to at a time to be determined by me with the concurrence of the Republican leader, not consultation with him, but with concurrence with him.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Mr. President, first I'd like to welcome the President to the Capitol today. Members on both sides of the aisle are eager to hear from him and to share their own thoughts. We look forward to a spirited and constructive exchange. It is often said that of all the questions we face as lawmakers, none is more serious or indeed more difficult than the question of whether to commit ourselves to military action. That's why it is so important for us to have this debate, to lay out the arguments for and against military action in Syria, to let the public know where we stand on this issue and why. But if debates like this are always challenging, in some ways this one has been even more difficult. Not because of some political calculus, though cynics will always suspect that. No, this debate has been made more difficult because even those of us who truly want to support the Commander-in-Chief have struggled to understand the purpose of the mission. Over the past several days, I've spoken with a lot of people, a lot of Kentuckians. And I have to tell you, most of them aren't exactly clear about the mission themselves, or shy about saying so. What I've told them is that I understand their concerns. I share them. I also appreciate the war weariness out there. But then I tell them there's other potential concerns that we can't ignore here either. Chief among them is the fact that the credibility of the Commander-in-Chief matters. And related to that is the fact that we can't afford as a country to withdraw from the world stage. So no one should be faulted for being skeptical about this proposal, regardless of what party they're in, or for being dumbfounded, literally dumbfounded at the ham-handed manner in which the White House announced it. There's absolutely no reason to signal to the enemy when and how and for how long you plan to strike them. None. As I've said before, you don't send out a save-the-date card to the enemy. And yet there are other important considerations to keep in mind here as well that go beyond the wisdom or the marketing of the proposal. I've spent a lot of time weighing all of these things. I've thought a lot about America's obligations and the irreplaceable role that I've always believed and still believe America plays in the world. And I've also thought a lot about the context, about this President's vision and his record, and what it says about whether we should be confident in his ability to bring about a favorable outcome in Syria. Because how we got to this point says a lot about where we may be headed. And that's why, before announcing my vote, I think it's important to look back at some of the President's other decisions on matters of foreign policy and national security, and then turn back to what he's proposing now in Syria, because in the end, these things simply can't be separated. Now, it's not exactly a state secret that I'm no fan of this President's foreign policy. On the deepest level, I think it comes down to a fundamentally different view of America's role in the world. Unlike the President, I've always been a firm and unapologetic believer in the idea that America isn't just another nation among many, that we are indeed exceptional. As I've said, I believe we have a duty as a superpower without imperialistic aims to help maintain an international order and balance of power that we and other allies have worked very hard to achieve over the years. The President, on the other hand, has always been a very reluctant commander-in-chief. We saw that in the rhetoric of his famous Cairo speech and in speeches he gave in other foreign capitals in the early days of his administration. The tone and the policies that followed were meant to project a humbler, more withdrawn America. And frankly, I'm hard-pressed to see any good that came from any of that. Any list would have to start with the arbitrary deadlines for military withdrawal and the triumphant declaration that Guantanamo would be closed within a year without any plan of what to do with its detainees. There were the executive orders that ended the CIA detention and interrogation programs. We all saw the so-called reset with Russia and how the President's stated commitment to a world without nuclear weapons led him to hastily sign an arms treaty with Russia that did nothing to substantially reduce its nuclear stockpile or its tactical nuclear weapons. We saw the President announce a strategic pivot to the Asia-Pacific region without any real plan to fund it and an effort to end the capture, interrogation, and detention of terrorists, as well as the return of an old idea that terrorism should be treated as a law enforcement matter. After a decade-long counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, we've seen the President's failure to invest in the kind of strategic modernization that's needed to make this pivot to Asia meaningful. Specifically, his failure to make the kind of investments that are needed to maintain our dominance in the Asia-Pacific theater, in the kind of naval, air, and Marine Corps forces that we'll need there in the years ahead, could have tragic consequences down the road. His domestic agenda has also obviously had serious implications for our global standing. While borrowing trillions and wasting taxpayer dollars here at home, the President has imposed a policy of austerity at the Pentagon that threatens to undermine our stabilizing presence around the globe. And of course, we've seen how eager the President is to declare an end to the war on terror. Unfortunately, the world just hasn't cooperated. They haven't cooperated with the President's vision or his hopes. Far from responding favorably to this gentler approach, it's become arguably more dangerous. We've learned the hard way that being nice to our enemies doesn't make them like you or clear a path to peace. I understand that the President ran for office on an anti-war platform, that his rise to political power was marked by a determination to get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq and declare an end to the war on terror. I know he'd rather focus on his domestic agenda, but the ongoing threat from al-Qaeda and its affiliates and the turmoil unleashed by uprisings in North Africa and the broader Middle East, not to mention the rise of Chinese military power, make it clear to me at least that this is not the time for America to shrink from the world stage. The world is a dangerous place. In the wake of the Arab Spring, large parts of the Sinai, of Libya, of Syria are now basically ungoverned. We've seen prison breaks in Iraq, Pakistan, Libya, and the release of hundreds of prisoners in Egypt. Terrorists have also escaped from prisons in Yemen, a country that is no more ready to detain the terrorists at Guantanamo now than they were back in 2009. And the flow of foreign fighters into Syria suggests that the civil war there will last for years, regardless of whether Assad is still in power. Yes, the President deserves praise for weakening al-Qaeda's senior leadership, but the threat we face from al-Qaeda affiliates is very real. These terrorists are adaptable. They're versatile, lethal, resilient, and they aren't going away. Pockets of these terrorists extend from North Africa to the Persian Gulf, and it's time he faced up to it. And it's time to face up to something else as well. International order is not maintained by some global police force, which only exists in a liberal fantasy. International order is maintained, its backbone is American military might. Which brings me back to Syria. For 2 years now, Syria has been mired in a ferocious civil war with more than 100,000 killed with conventional arms. That's according to UN estimates. This tragic situation has promoted many to look to the United States for help. And so 1 year ago, President Obama made a declaration. If Assad used or started moving chemical weapons, he'd do something about it. Well, as we all know, on August 21st of this year, that red line was crossed. The President's delayed response was to call for a show of force for targeted, limited strikes against the regime. We've been told that the purpose of these strikes is to deter and degrade Assad's regime's ability to use chemical weapons. So let's take a closer look at these aims. First, no one disputes that the atrocities committed in Syria in recent weeks are unspeakable. No one disputes that those responsible for these crimes against the innocent should be held to account. We were absolutely right, of course, to condemn these crimes. But let's be very clear about something. These attacks, monstrous as they are, were not a direct attack against the United States or one of its treaty allies. And just so there's no confusion, let me assure everyone that if a weapon of mass destruction were used against the U.S. or one of our allies, Congress would react immediately with an authorization for the use of force in support of an overwhelming response. I would introduce the resolution myself. So no leader in North Korea or Iran or any other enemy of the United States should take any solace if the U.S. were not to respond to these attacks with an action against Syria. We will never, never tolerate the use of chemical weapons against the United States or any of its treaty allies. Second, in the course of administration hearings and briefings over the past several days, Secretary of State Kerry has revealed that Assad has used chemical weapons repeatedly over the last year. So there's a further question here about why the administration didn't respond on those occasions. Third, Assad, as I've indicated, has killed tens of thousands of people with conventional weapons. Is there any reason to believe he won't continue if the President's strikes are as limited as we're told they would be? Fourth, what if degrading Assad's control of those weapons, if in doing that, you make it easier for other extremist elements like those associated with al-Nusra Front and al-Qaeda to actually get hold of them themselves? Or what if by weakening the Syrian military you end up tilting the military balance toward a fractured opposition that's in no position to govern or control anything right now? I think the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, put this particular issue best when he recently suggested in a letter to Congress that the issue here isn't about choosing between two sides in Syria, it's about choosing one among many sides. And that in his estimation, even if we were to choose sides, the side we chose wouldn't be in a position to promote their own interest or ours. That's the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And then there's the question of how Assad himself would react to U.S. action in Syria. If Assad views an air campaign as preparation for regime change, then he may lose all constraint in the use of his arsenal, chemical or otherwise, and lose any incentive whatsoever to move to the negotiating table. It's very clear that the unintended consequences of this strike could very well be a new cycle of escalation, which then drags us into a larger war than we're all seeking to avoid. Some have even suggested that the humanitarian crisis surrounding the Syrian civil war could actually be made worse, as a result of even targeted U.S. strikes. In the end, then, the President's proposal seems fundamentally flawed, since if it's too narrow, it may not deter Assad's further use of chemical weapons, but if it's too broad, it risks jeopardizing the security of these same stockpiles, potentially putting them into the hands of extremists. And that's why I think we're compelled in this case to apply a more traditional standard to whether to proceed with the use of force. One that asks a simple question: does Assad's use of chemical weapons pose a threat to the national security interest of the United States? And the answer to that question is fairly obvious. Even the President himself says it doesn't. Now, one could argue, as I've suggested, that there is an important national security concern at play, that we have a very strong interest in preserving the credibility of our Commander-in-Chief, regardless of the party in power, and in giving him the political support that reinforces that credibility. This is an issue I take very seriously. It's the main reason I wanted to take my time in making a final decision. But ultimately, I've concluded that being credible on Syria requires presenting a credible response and having a credible strategy. For all those reasons I've indicated, this proposal just doesn't pass muster. Indeed, if through this limited strike the President's credibility is not restored because Assad uses chemical weapons again, what then? And new targets aimed at toppling the regime, which end up jeopardizing control of these same chemical weapons stashes, allowing them to fall into the hands of al-Qaeda or others intent on using them against the United States or our allies, where would the cycle of escalation end? Now, last night we learned about a Russian diplomatic gambit to forestall U.S. military action through a proposal to secure and eventually destroy the Syrian chemical weapons stockpile. This morning there are initial reports that suggest Syria is supportive of it. Let me remind everyone that even if this is agreed to, it's still a long way off to reaching an agreement at the United Nations, to Syria gaining entry to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and to eventually securing and destroying the stockpile. As we've seen in my own state of Kentucky, where we've been working for 30 years to finally destroy a stockpile of chemical weapons, destroying chemical weapons is extremely challenging and requires a great deal of attention to detail and safety. Nonetheless, this proposal is obviously worth exploring. But more broadly, and this is my larger point, this one punitive strike we're debating could not make up for the President's performance over the last 5 years. The only way for him to achieve the credibility he seeks is by embracing the kind of serious, integrated national security plan that matches strategy to resources, capabilities to commitments, and which shows our allies around the world that the U.S. is fully engaged and ready to act at a moment's notice in all the major areas of concern around the globe, whether it's the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, or in the South China Sea. And just as importantly, that he's willing to invest in that strategy for the long term. In Syria, a limited strike would not resolve the civil war there, nor will it remove Assad from power. There appears to be no broader strategy to train, advise, and assist a vetted opposition group on a meaningful scale, as we did during the Cold War. What's needed in Syria is what's needed almost everywhere else in the world from America right now, a clear strategy and a president determined to carry it out. When it comes to Syria, our partners in the Middle East, countries like Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, all of them face real consequences from instability, refugee flows, and the growth of terrorist networks. Responding to this crisis requires a regional strategy and leadership. What we've gotten instead is an administration that seems more interested in telling us what the mission is not, than what it is. We've gotten the same timid, reluctant leadership that I've seen from the president for nearly 5 years. As I've just said, this decision was not easy. When the President of the United States asks you to take a question like this seriously, you do so. Because just as our credibility in Syria is tied up with our credibility in places like Iran and North Korea, so too is the credibility of the Commander-in-Chief tied up to a large extent with America's credibility in general. There's no doubt about that. So let me repeat. I'll stand shoulder to shoulder with this president or any other in any case where our vital national security interests are threatened, our treaty allies are attacked, or we face an imminent threat. As for Israel, very few people, if anyone, expect that Syria would test its readiness to respond on its own, which just goes to show you the importance of credibility on the world stage. As Prime Minister Netanyahu put it last week, the enemies of Israel have very good reason not to test its might. But the Prime Minister should know nonetheless that America stands with him. I've never been an isolationist, and a vote against this resolution shouldn't be confused by anyone as a turn in that direction. But just as the most committed isolationist could be convinced of the need for intervention under the right circumstances when confronted with a threat, so too do the internationalists among us believe that all interventions are not created equal.
97 and the nays are 6, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2747, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2747, a bill to amend Title 40 United States Code to transfer certain functions from the Government Accountability Office to the Department of Labor relating to the processing of claims for the payment of workers who were not paid appropriate wages until certain provisions of such title.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
The second of 3 votes in this series, moving to 5-minute voting now. Members voting on a bill aiming to simplify claims processing for federal contractor employees. And then it'll be votes on a lands bill. When the House finishes this series of votes, we are expecting members to go into recess to attend a Congressional Gold Medal ceremony honoring the 1963 Birmingham school bombing victims. At about 4:15, lawmakers are expected to return for further debate and votes on bills for today. There is no scheduled action on a Syria resolution among the bills being debated today, but later this week we do expect debate on legislation related to military action in Syria.
this vote, the yeas are 396. On this vote, the yeas are 396, the nays are 10. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Would all members please take their seats? Would the House come to order? Would all members please take their seats, cease conversations? Would the House come to order? The Chair would ask that all present to rise for the purpose of a moment of silence. The Chair asks now that the House now observe a moment of silence in remembrance of our brave men and women in uniform who have given their lives in the service of our nation in Iraq and Afghanistan, and their families, and all who serve in our armed forces and their families. Thank you.
Okay. Without objection, 5-minute voting will continue. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, to suspend the rules and pass S-130, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 137, Senate 130, a bill to require the Secretary of the Interior to convey certain federal land to the Powell Recreation District in the state of Wyoming.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
The last of 3 votes for now. This is a 5-minute vote on a federal land transfer bill. The House pausing for a moment of silence for members of the armed forces. Tomorrow, of course, the anniversary of the attack on the World Trade Center. We are expecting further remarks and tributes tomorrow during the day. A quick reminder that we expect the House to recess until about 4:15 after these votes to attend the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony honoring the 1963 Birmingham school bombing victims. And after that, members will return for further debate and votes on bills for the day. The Associated Press reporting the UN Security Council has scheduled closed consultations this afternoon on a resolution aimed at securing and destroying Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. Council diplomats said Russia asked for the meeting. The Syrian government has accepted a proposal from Russia, its most powerful ally, to give up its chemical weapons stockpile. On top of all this, France has announced that it plans to introduce a Security Council resolution to ensure international verification of the disarmament. Also earlier today, President Obama had separate meetings with Senate Democrat and Republican leaders. Tonight, he will speak to the nation on a U.S. response to the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Over 1,400 people were killed in that attack in Damascus, Syria on August 21st. The president, scheduled for 9 Eastern, will have live coverage followed by your phone calls, emails, and tweets.
On this vote, the yeas are 408 and the nays are 1. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the House will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
The House is recessed so members can attend a Congressional Gold Medal ceremony honoring the 1963 Birmingham bombing victims. The leaders of both the House and the Senate will speak at that ceremony. When members return, more votes on bills debated today, and we'll have live coverage of those votes here on C-SPAN. Well, the UN Security Council has scheduled closed consultations this afternoon on a resolution aimed at securing and destroying Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles. Council diplomats said Russia asked for that meeting. The Syrian